As one of my many other hobbies, I like to write. This time, model railroading and writing intersected to form the body of this week's long-form video on YouTube. I walk through how these cars came into being, both in my imagined shortline, the Morefield Southern, and in the real world, the real HO scale world. I walk through how a railroader's busybody wife picked out the paint and set the wheels in motion before consulting her husband. We'll also take a look at my custom paint project on these cars, which included the highly unusual step of airbrushing craft acrylic paint onto these secondhand HO Scale MDC Roundhouse cars. I also did some Morefield Southern grain cars in HO Scale using the Athearn PS hopper car during the winter of 22-23. I'll put a link to those in the description. Having your own freelance railroad means you get to observe rule number 1 a lot. Yes, it's my railroad, but I also derive a lot of joy in thinking up ways to explain what I'm doing. You've seen this pair of purple HO Scale MSRY boxcars that appear on this channel a few times in the past. Most notably, you've seen them bringing up the rear on the colorful video about my per diem boxcars. I'll put another link in the description for that. Switching between fact and fiction now, I'll let you know when I'm doing this because it can get a little bit confusing, especially if you're not familiar with my railroad or the area that I'm modeling. The fictional South Dakota Shortline Morefield Southern operates on track laid in real life by the Milwaukee Railroad north from Sioux Falls in the southeast part of South Dakota in the early 1900s. Fact: the Milwaukee line to Morefield and Colton, South Dakota, northwestward from there, split off of the Milwaukee Road's branch line from Sioux Falls to Dale Rapids and parts north about a half-mile north of Renner, South Dakota. The real-life line was abandoned and scrapped during the opening days of World War II. In fiction, the line survived, although with minimal traffic in the latter half of the century. This line's future was thrown into even more doubt when the Milwaukee Road went bankrupt in 1981. A skilled and caring shortline operator named J.R. Warren and his company took over the segment in 1982 and did its best. It did as best as could be expected with the line. With minimal staff and Spartan equipment, the line continues to operate through the present day. As with many short lines, Warren discovered a source of revenue through railcars for hire. The Morefield Southern was no exception. Railcars with the company's reporting mark MSRY spread to all corners of the country and Canada and sometimes Mexico. When time came to paint some of the railroad's ragged-looking boxcars, Warren resolved to get the best deal on paint and lettering as possible. He'd been putting off the final decision-making on cheap paint and lettering until after he'd attended a shortline conference that was coming up in Fort Worth, Texas. JR's wife, Maxine Warren, sometimes liked to insert herself into the business decisions of the company. She was generally known to the small operating staff as likable, but sometimes a little loud and known to stir the pot unnecessarily. Maxine had heard the story about an Iowa farmer's elevator operator's wife that had chose a shade of light pink for a very long string of grain-loading hopper cars. She was inspired by the woman's innovation. It happened to be a crisp mid-fall day that day. Fall memories caused her mind to drift out the window to tossing the football back and forth as a child with her late father. Further inspiration suddenly came to her regarding the colors of her dad's favorite NFL team playing on a Sunday afternoon at Met Stadium in Bloomington, Minnesota. So that next Monday morning, Maxine slipped into JR's home office and onto his IBM-compatible computer and made some phone calls during his week-long business trip. Maxine always abhorred the generally grungy and unsightly look of the rail cars that her husband's dirty and grungy engines hauled around. So rather than accepting her husband's options of boring white, gray, or chalky blue, she chose something a bit more eye-catching, something different. It happened that a paint distributor had on hand just what she was looking for. Being a hard-to-sell shade of paint in a large quantity, the distributor was keen to cut a deal. The contractor in charge of painting a dozen or so rail cars liked the idea so much that he suggested attaching some adornments fashioned out of light-gauge sheet metal. Knowing full well that the decorations would likely fall victim to vandals or legal representation from the league headquarters, not too much time or energy was expended on adding them. The next week, after JR returned home from Texas, he caught sight of one of the newly painted cars being extracted from the contractor's makeshift paint booth. After accosting the paint contractor's employee, he learned that his wife was behind the interesting choice of paint. At supper that night, he learned from her that she'd gotten the company a deal on enough paint to do a dozen or so cars the same way, and had saved enough money to cover the cost of the added sheet metal adornments, and had still been better than break even or so had she chosen a less imaginative color. JR's initial irritation with his wife's overstep wore off quickly. So here's where we cross back into fact. To be honest, this project began simply because I wanted purple or violet cars to run with the rainbow per diem Boxcars train. The concept of the football came later. These secondhand MDC Roundhouse cars were in need of a little TLC when I got them. I began by stripping them with 91% isopropyl alcohol in a closed container. The lettering in the paint sloughs right off with a little bit of a toothbrush, and you do want to use 91% isopropyl in a closed container because it will evaporate off very quickly. I then primed them out of a rattle can using Krylon. Then I airbrushed the cars using purple craft paint. It may have been Apple Barrel, I'm not sure. It was one of those cheapy Walmart ones. It just happened to be the color that I wanted. And like Maxine, I found it cheap. I used a combination of Microscale decal sets for this project, a block lettering set and a set specifically for Southern Pacific Boxcars because I wanted the yellow, and I always thought that Hydro Cushion logo was pretty cool. The helmet horn graphic was printed on standard paper with my black and white laser printer and fixed to a very thin sheet of styrene with a thin film of white glue and then cut to shape. I glued the styrene to the car's ribs using a few small drops of CA. I hope you've enjoyed this walk through Morefield Southern's unique purple boxcars. Maybe next time you're trackside, you'll catch a glimpse of one of these going by in a manifest train. I can think of no other sport that symbolizes fall quite like football does in America. I hope your fall is going better than the Vikings' first regular season game of 2023. We're really busy with fall activities, mostly kids stuff like flag football, tackle football, and fall soccer. In addition to that, we have the normal schoolwork and homeowner chores, and bringing in the next season's worth of firewood. If you like this video, go ahead and click that like button, subscribe for more, and hopefully, if I'm lucky, I'll see you in the next one.